Hello. Welcome to Bear Paw Media and Education's Public Legal Education webinar series. My name is Nadine Callahoo Hansen. Bear Paw Media and Education is a department of Native Counseling Services of Alberta, and our primary goals are to make public legal education understandable, accessible, and affordable for Indigenous people. We at Bear Paw are not lawyers, although we do endeavor to make sure that this information is correct and current to the best of our abilities and is edited by lawyers. Of course, laws change with elections and societal values. So this information is designed to be general in nature and may not apply to your specific situation. It may be necessary to consult a lawyer for advice to assist you. For more information, you can go to our website at bearpawlegalresources.ca or follow us on social media at Bear Paw Legal. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land in which we gather is Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground and home for the many Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, and Nakota Sioux. Today's topic will be understanding Indigenous identity. So I'd like to begin with a video that was created by the Bear Paw Media team.
My name is Alexandra Lazarovich, and I'm a member of the Whitefish First Nation. Growing up in Canada, I've heard many opinions about who I was or who I was supposed to be as an Aboriginal person.
As Native people, we know that there's certain stories that are told about us and that are lived about us, and then they become part of our lived experience.
Racist stereotypes of Native people typically arise around the polar opposition of noble and degraded savages. They are degraded versions of their own ancestors.
Drunks, welfare.
People ask you where you learned to talk so well, or ask you whether you only had to read half the books in law school.
Parents or grandparents didn't want to identify as Aboriginal because of the prejudices that some of them had to face. The reality was it was there.
In high school, they would run around me and do woo, and that was one instance, I think, where I felt, my goodness, these people don't even know who I am. They only see the TV Indian person.
All of these are images which don't conform to anything about lived reality. And in any case, when that arises, then people are endangered in various ways. And they become dehumanized, and they become the subjects of all kinds of dangerous practices.
For decades, partial truths and stereotypes have formed the Canadian public's ideas of Aboriginal peoples. But how have these perceptions affected our individual and collective sense of identity? What are the factors that shape who we are as Aboriginal peoples?
Long ago, when explorers sailed west from Europe in their wooden ships, they sought a northwest passage to the Orient. What they found was a new world.
Since the first early interactions between European colonists and Aboriginal peoples of Canada, a number of treaties, acts, and laws were established. Early settlers made up labels to identify Aboriginal peoples, which are still used today. Indians, Eskimos, Indigenous, Native American, First Nations, treaty, status, non-status, urban Indian, Inuit, and Métis. Ultimately, the legal control over who is an Aboriginal person still resides with the federal government.
Being Aboriginal is both a public or cultural perception, but it's also a legal category. The Indian Act today creates several legal categories of Aboriginal people. And those people have that legal standing only through participation in that system.
There are many distinct Aboriginal cultural groups across Canada, from Cree to Ojibwe to Gitxsan to Blackfoot. each with their own unique customs, culture, and traditions. However, the Canadian Constitution only groups Aboriginal people into 3 legal categories: Indians, Métis, and Inuit.
When you think about it historically, our communities had our own ways of defining who was a community member, and it wasn't based on race or blood quantum or any of those things. We had ways of adopting people into our nations, ways of integrating between nations, and ways of continually evolving and defining ourselves as who we are. Identities have always been changing throughout time, right? And we've always had the right to do that. And it was with this, interference on the part of the state that suddenly it became so prescribed and so static about who is what and what you are. Why, as Indigenous people in Canada, are we distinct in terms of identity issues? Is because it's been formed for us by the state.
The Indian Act is federal legislation first passed in 1876. For over a century, the Indian Act has controlled every aspect of Aboriginal life and identity. To be federally recognized as an Indian, individuals must be able to comply with a very distinct standard of government regulation laid out in the Indian Act. These are the different legal categories of Aboriginal people. Status Indian, a person who is legally registered as an Indian under the Indian Act. Non-status Indian, a person who is not registered as an Indian under the Indian Act. Inuit, an Aboriginal people in northern Canada who live in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, northern Quebec, and northern Labrador. Métis, people of mixed First Nation and European ancestry who identify themselves as Métis, as distinct from First Nations people, Inuit, or non-Aboriginal people. First Nations, a term that came into usage in the 1970s to replace the word Indian. However, no legal definition of it exists.
The laws of Canada have primarily been exclusive. The main focus of them is to limit who can be Indian, at a loss, I think, of a much fuller, deeper, richer understanding of who we are as a people.
If you look at the various definitions of indigenousness, it comes down to a particular set of things. Sometimes it's priority. Are you the descendant of the group that was there first? Sometimes it has to do with cultural practice. For example, do you have a particular kind of spirituality and you are not a member of a world religion like Islam or Christianity? Are you a speaker of your indigenous language? My problem with all this is that it's easy to find people deficient on those terms. Checklist notions of indigeneity, do you have these and these properties, don't work, because there are people who are rightfully Indigenous people who don't fit those criteria.
It was in the past, decided at a certain point in history, and it's kind of arbitrary sometimes about who was where and which communities get defined as what, always from an exterior source, right? And we have to always be mindful of the fact that this wasn't ours to begin with. It was a very deliberate strategy of dividing us so that we begin to fight amongst ourselves among the meager resources that are there.
For more than 100 years, the Indian Act stated that status Indians were considered to be wards of the state and were unfit to take care of themselves and their children. Aboriginal children across Canada were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to residential schools, a boarding school system created by the Canadian government and run by the churches. It was a way to strip Aboriginal children of their language and culture and assimilate them into Canadian society. Many students at residential schools were subjected to severe physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. For many survivors, attending residential schools was a negative experience that impacted generations of Aboriginal families and created a deep sense of shame about being Aboriginal. These historical and legal perspectives are aspects of how our identity is formed, but it was time to examine our backgrounds and cultural influences. I spoke with 3 members of Aboriginal communities in Alberta.
No matter where I meet Aboriginal people, one of the first things you ask is, where are you from? We identify with that, no matter who we are as Aboriginal people. Where are you from, eh? The Kikino Métis settlement. We're in the northeast part of the settlement now, so we're heading west. To the other end of the settlement is 20 kilometers, and then 20 kilometers to the south.
What does Kikino mean again?
That means our home in Cree. This is it. This is our home. The Kikino Métis settlement is 107,000 acres, or 4 2/3 townships. That's a good chunk of land. It creates, opportunity for us. The Métis people were always good hunters, and were always kind of tied to the hunting and having that ability to live off the land. So, those ties have always been there. On Kikino here, I am an entrepreneur. I have a buffalo ranch here, bison ranch. We have horses, we have pets. My wife's a dog breeder, so the entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well here. These big guys here, they're our team that pull our carriages. This here is Max and Jake here. A lot of our history was around the horses and everything else too, and in the early years there was transportation, and
give me some first.
A lot of times your life probably depended on it. Another way is keeping the culture alive is through the raising bison. Ties to our history and that. I've always had the dream of owning my own bison ranch when I was young. We as the Métis settlement members, I guess, are fortunate where we don't have blood quantum as part of the makeup of our of what makes you Métis or not. The Métis National Council definition is you have to be tied back to the Red River. So any one of those other nationalities with an Aboriginal woman could create a Métis person. Skin color, you see it where, I know my wife faced that a few times where she's light, fair-skinned and light hair. And people, oh, she's not Métis. How do you prove you're Métis? How do you prove your identity, whether your ties go back to Red River or back to Scrip or whatever, right? Some of those issues are coming forward now. So that's another process that we'll have to define.
I grew up thinking I was full Aboriginal, like I was just originally from the reserve. And it wasn't until I moved to the settlement that I actually developed the sense of, that I was a Métis person and that's who I was. I went through a really troubled time in my life. I started getting into drinking a lot and drugs. Yeah, and missing school, just not having a care in the world. And I got really kind of depressed and, I had a lot of issues with suicidal thoughts around that thing, and kind of, I just felt like I was stuck there and that there was nothing to do. So I called my dad and I told him kind of what I was going through, and he invited me to live with him. And ever since then, I've been living in Buffalo Lake, and that was since the age of 14. I identify myself as a Métis, and I am proud of it. I love being who I am. I love having the heritage that I have. I'm very proud of it. I really feel tied to the Métis community, and I really want to go and give back to my community before I give back to anywhere else, because that's where I got my roots from, and that's where I kind of developed into the person that I am today.
I wanted to look into my own family roots and learn more about how my family stayed strong and kept our culture alive.
Can you tell me about you being an Indian princess?
I've always been an Indian princess.
Well, how old were you when you won that title?
I think I was 19 years old. I just got back from Ontario.
Uh-huh.
And there was this princess pageant. And my mom said, okay, you want to run? I'll make you whatever you need, So she made me my outfit. So I became the Indian princess, but we had to sell all these tickets, but we also I had to make a speech at the Friendship Center, and there were 5 panelists. And so I had to talk about my views as to what I wanted to do, right? It's a role, right? And I think a lot of people have to understand that there are different roles you play. But being Indian is not a role. Being Indian means who you are, the very person you are, the very essence of your soul, the roots that you come from. I was born in Gruard, Alberta, small community on the shores of Lesser Slave Lake. From very humble beginnings. My mom and dad had to do a lot of things to make a living. And we were brought up with an ethic that said that you had to work really hard in order for you to be able to get where you want to go. And my mom was the driving force of our culture and making sure that we knew who we were. We always had that sense of pride, that sense of knowing, the sense of my grandma was always around, our aunts were always around, that maternal and matrilineal line was always lived to the fullest by my mom. She knew if we didn't know who we were, that we'd get lost somewhere, and she never wanted that. So she was always strong in terms of what she taught us and how she taught us, and knowing who we were, knowing the very essence of that identity. She taught us everything about life and family and how to survive in this world.
When you have strong ties to your community, you can go anywhere in this world and you always feel safe that you have a place to go home. I know that the retention of your culture, a lot of it is based on the retention of your language. If you lose your language, you lose your culture. And we're very fortunate here to have our own school in Kikino. Cultural programs that they put into the curriculum is awesome. You know, they're teaching them Cree. They have fiddle groups and that. And they also did jigging. You know, that's part of the Métis culture. That's being taught in our school.
People know that I'm Aboriginal by my skin tone, but they'll know I'm Métis if they know about a Métis sash. And a lot of people take curiosity to this because they see the different colors and they figure it symbolizes something. So I'm glad when they ask. To me, I guess it's just it helps to identify who I am when I'm in public. A sash still is a symbol of my Métis culture and my Métis identity, but at the same time, I'm still going to use it for the same things our ancestors did, which is a tool, whether it's, you know, a scarf or just something to wrap around your bag and carry. So when I would actually wear my Métis sash around my neck, people would be like, oh, nice scarf. And I'd be like, actually, it's not a scarf. What it is, it's a Métis sash. And I would start to, you know, kind of tell them about Métis heritage, everything that I do know I'd be willing to share because I just want people to know that our people out there and that we exist. Identity for me was just knowing that I have Aboriginal culture, and not only because of the color of my skin, it's just knowing that, you know, I have those Aboriginal roots.
Part of the current Indigenous world is those adverse circumstances and the scarring that creates, but it can also create positive outcomes. You know, people can be motivated to reestablish their connection to what it was their parents and ancestors had in mind and how to live. And people all across Canada are doing that.
We have to be realistic about the fact that our societies and our laws have been impacted by colonialism, but we don't have to be defined by that. People are on all different kinds of levels pushing back the colonial story and creating new stories for ourselves.
So much of what's written about Native people, whether it's in the media or whatever's produced about us, is negative, and it kind of pathologizes Indigenous people. And so I wanted to write something that was like, well, no, it's not all negative. And in spite of all that people are up against, look at this magnificence that that is there in terms of people's identities.
We have to start making sure people know and understand their language. They have to be able to understand the teachings in order for them to be able to come together as a people again.
Young Aboriginal people in this country are operating at a whole other level now. And a lot of them are becoming very sophisticated in terms of law and politics, and they're communicating this to each other with all kinds of social media, and a new world is coming.
It's up to us as the next generation to just take that step forward and, not have to lean back on what had happened to our people, that, it's up to us to push forward and just to, create the change and be the difference for our future generations.
As an Aboriginal woman, I've come to understand that Aboriginal identity is a unique and personal journey, and legal definitions don't have the power to define us. We have to look to our vibrant communities, our loving families, our beautiful culture, and unique language to form our identity.
So I hope you enjoyed that video. It's available for viewing at any time on our website. Prior to European contact, every part of Canada was controlled by different groups of Indigenous people. Each Aboriginal group was distinctive with its own culture and language. So what does it mean to have inherent or pre-existing rights? All Canadians have the same rights and freedoms. However, the Canadian Constitution, or actually Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, gives certain Aboriginal groups additional rights connected to specific areas of land. The rights come from unique traditional land uses before European contact. These inherent or pre-existing rights are part of overall Indigenous rights. They can include protection of burial sites or fishing and hunting practices that are specific to a particular location. Each Indigenous nation was unique with different languages and cultures shaped by their environment. Indigenous nations did not exist in isolation from each other. Some groups had conflicts over resources. Members often intermarried. These factors changed territory boundaries over time. So what are the things that, what are the areas that groups or nations need to be in control of in order to be considered a fully functioning, self-governing nation or society? Their ability to control their membership, their government structure, their own language, laws and justice, healthcare, education, lands and resources, and wealth distribution. Give them the ability to control those elements of their society, which then meant that they could be self-governing. Prior to European contact, Indigenous nations were fully capable of governing themselves, but their ability to do so was about to change. In 1492, Christopher Columbus left Spain searching for an ocean route to India. When he landed, he actually believed that he was in India and that the people he discovered were Indians. This was to remain the belief for the next 500 years. Other European groups started to arrive, and by the 18th century, the Americas were being explored in earnest. Britain, France, and Spain all arrived to claim the New World for their own. They approached the land as if they were empty and theirs for the taking. The term for this is terra nullius, empty land, a phrase that means land that belongs to no one. They believed that the indigenous people there that did not own the land. Therefore, they could, by way of occupation, assume control. Worldview comparisons between European and indigenous is very much like night and day. The Europeans believed that the land was something that could be bought and sold and belonged to the people, where indigenous people believed that they belonged to the land. Europeans believed that the land could be owned and sold as a commodity, assets, where the indigenous people believed that we're part of the environment as a whole. So we're only one piece of a big jigsaw puzzle or circle. Europeans believed that people determine how land and its resources should be used, where the indigenous people believe that we're not above or superior to the land. Again, that we are all an equal part and we all have a responsibility or an obligation to each other. By 1756, Britain, France, and Spain were involved in a global conflict that included a battle for control of North America. These three countries were supported by the indigenous nation allies. By 1763, Britain had won the 7 Years' War. A treaty was negotiated in Paris, giving Britain control over New World lands that France once claimed. Britain believed they now ruled North America. By 1756, Britain claimed control over the eastern seaboard and the Hudson Bay drainage basin. The French controlled mid-central continent east to the Mississippi River, while the Spanish controlled Central and South America. So if you ever wonder why in the Americas, the three primary languages are English, French, and Spain. And even when you look at where those languages are predominant, it correlates to back in 1756 when these three countries were laying claim to sections of the Americas. However, during the 7-Year War, Indigenous nations were not consulted when negotiating that treaty that concluded the 7-Year War. So many nations had been aligned with France during the war, and their members weren't happy with the outcome. Several Indigenous nations banded together and attacked British forts and settlements, and as a result, many people died. Chief Pontiac was one of the leaders that led this rebellion. Indigenous peoples outnumbered British subjects, and they certainly made their point. Britain knew that they needed a method of lasting peace. So King George III, in history, I love King George III because he was pretty progressive. He knew that he needed to form some type of treaty with the indigenous people in order to bring peace over the land. And so King George III created the Royal Proclamation Act of 1763, which laid out 4 important principles. First of all, it recognized indigenous people as nations. We were here first. And so if people wanted to assume control of any lands, resources, inherent rights to indigenous people, because we were declared nations, that they would have to form a treaty with the indigenous people. So, which leads us to point number 2. It recognized that Britain should enter into treaties with Indigenous nations to purchase their lands and resources. 3, it recognized that without treaties, Britain could not have the authority to rule North America. Ultimately, it recognized Indigenous title. It recognized Indigenous rights as the first people to be in the Americas. King George III knew a bold move was needed to make peace with North America's Indigenous nations. He quoted as saying, "We shall now rule North America. We shall protect our Indian nations. We shall not go into hunting in Indian hunting grounds without purchasing their lands first. We, and only we, shall sign treaties with our Indian nations." The Royal Proclamation is viewed by some scholars as Canada's first constitution. By 1763, the British Crown had laid out the foundation for Canada's treaty relationship with Aboriginal nations. Britain now must sign treaties. And another quote, "And whereas it is just and reasonable and essential to our interests and the security of our colonies that the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded," another word, a fancy word for given up, "to or purchased by us, are reserved to them, or any of them, as their hunting grounds." So then, what is a treaty? Treaty is different than a law. A law is something that is passed by a country's government to govern the citizens of that land. A treaty is an international agreement made between two or more nations. Treaty making with Indigenous nations, agreements outlined that was included in deals. Indigenous rights and titles could be exchanged for treaty rights. So Indigenous title equals ownership of land. Indigenous rights equals practices, traditions, or customs. Treaty rights could include the rights to hunt, trap or fish, education, healthcare, language, practice certain commercial activities, or other things agreed upon between the nations. So I'd like to just briefly go over the treaty-making history in Canada. Between 1725 and 1779, the peace and friendship treaties were created. They started on the East Coast. They weren't long or detailed. Purpose was to forego military alliances and facilitate trade between Indigenous nations and the early British colonizers for fish and fur. No lands were ceded, given up, by the Indigenous nations to the Crown. 1764 to 1854, the pre-Confederation treaties were negotiated with nations around the Great Lakes, Robinson Superior and Robinson Huron, and some nations living on Vancouver Island, the Douglas Treaties, made in response to the great influx of British loyalists leaving the US following America's War of Independence. Peaceful settlements. There were more details, including small parcels of land called reserves in these treaties. By 1871, the government at this point was starting to get smart in their treaty negotiations, and they realized that that in order to cover as much land as possible within Canada, that they needed to actually create a formal numbering system that fit together like a great big jigsaw puzzle, so that as much land was covered by the treaties rather than little patches here and there. So Treaty 1 to 6 were to facilitate settlement to the west and the development of the railway. So they started in the east and worked their way to the west as the railway was being built from east to west. Treaty 8 was created to facilitate the Klondike Gold Rush and other natural resource development in the north. And then Treaty 9 to 11 were created to accommodate settlers advancing west with the new railroad and to secure the oil and gold resources newly discovered in the north. And then Treaty 7 was, at least in part, created to ensure that American northward encroachment would not occur. So Treaty 7, at least in part, was created to be a buffer between Canada and the States. By 1923, a large portion of Canada was covered by the treaty. And prior to 1923, all treaties negotiated were all different. Treaty 8 history, which is here in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and north of Edmonton. Treaty 8 was signed in 1899. How the government actually initiated these treaty negotiations, because they covered large parcels of land and negotiating with large numbers of different Indigenous groups. So what they would do is they would post notices in all of the locations where Indians and half-breeds could meet with treaty commissioners who set up a tent at locations. So they would be posting notices at outposts, the Great West or Hudson Bay companies. So anywhere where there would be Indians or half-breeds, as they were referred to, would meet and see. And they would be brought together, all of these various different Indigenous groups would be brought together in one central location where they would negotiate all together. One treaty, Treaty 8, covers lots of different and separate Indigenous groups. And at these central locations, treaty commissioners would set up tents. And this is the shady part. The treaty commissioners would actually show up at these negotiations with a treaty already drafted in English before even being discussed with Indigenous people. And so the government already knew what they wanted and were going to demand to be in these treaty documents, even before it was even before the topic was broached with any Indigenous groups. So as the negotiations proceeded, ultimately what happened was the government made sure to negotiate all of their pre-existing, pre-written conditions in their draft, and any additional requirements or conditions negotiated by the Indigenous groups would have been added in the treaty commissioners' reports, but they never did quite make it into the treaties themselves, which were signed right there on the spot. Those treaty documents, treaty document rights included things like reserve land, salaries for teachers, farming assistance, one-time financial payments, a $5 annual treaty payment, the right to hunt, trap, and fish throughout the territory, among other things. And there's a little asterisk beside the right to hunt, trap, and fish because there is an exception, except on land needed by the government for resource extraction, settlement, or other purposes from time to time. The government's power to take up land covered by treaty is not unlimited. The government cannot require or take up any tract of land covered by treaty without first consulting with the Indigenous peoples concerned and, if warranted, accommodating their hunting, fishing, and trapping rights. And some lands that have been taken up by the government are nonetheless land in which the treaty rights to hunt, fish, and trap continue. Another limit on the treaty right to hunt, fish, and trap in the numbered treaties is the government's ability to make regulations for conservation purposes. What this means is that the government reserves the right to be able to put limits or exclusions on hunting, fishing, and trapping rights if it means the continuation, the sustainability of our natural resources. For example, if there's one species of animal that is on the verge of being extinct, then the government withholds the right or reserves the right to be able to exclude that species in Indigenous harvesting rights to make sure that that species continues for future generations. It's believed that treaty commissioners did not read directly from the treaty document. Instead, they made a number of verbal promises while a second commissioner wrote the promises in their notes, put them in an official commissioner's report, and sent it back to Ottawa. The Indigenous leaders took the commissioners at their word and signed, only to find that even though the promises were captured in the commissioner's report, they were not incorporated into the treaty documents. Disputes arise over the interpretation of what treaty rights are included, the spirit and intent of the treaties. To get a complete picture of the spirit and intent of the treaties, one needs to include the treaty documents, the treaty commissioners' reports, as well as Indigenous peoples' oral accounts from the leaders. There is some definitely some differences in interpretation of what it means to cede, release, surrender, and yield up rights forever, and free to continue to live as before, as well as land is meant to be shared. No one owns the land. 1725 to 1923, treaty negotiations were not consistent, and large portions of Canada still were not covered by the treaties. By 1973, many modern treaties have been signed all over Canada. These have some similarities with the historic treaties. However, the terms of the modern treaties are well understood by both parties. These are fully detailed, modern contracts outlining what each party understands to be a treaty deal. There are ongoing negotiations wherein agreements haven't yet been reached. In BC, at the time of confederations, government leaders didn't agree that an Aboriginal title to land existed or that treaties should be signed. In 1967, the Nisga'a Nation launched a lawsuit against the Government of Canada, stating that they had never entered a treaty relationship and therefore still held Aboriginal rights and title to their land and resources. In 1973, the Supreme Court of Canada agreed that Aboriginal title might still exist in areas without treaties. The decision prompted Canada and then BC to restart the treaty-making process. The ideas in the Royal Proclamation were upheld. Indigenous nations now have lawyers, advisors, and experts all participating in the negotiations. Now, when we look at Canada, the majority of the country is covered by treaties. Together, the historic and modern treaties make up Canada's 300-year-old treaty relationship. And although it is teeny tiny and hard to read, this is a map of Canada's treaties, treaty process. And so as you can see by the boundaries and different colors, that Canada does indeed make up a lot of covered land that is covered by treaty. A modern day treaty example would be in Tawasin, which is classified as a self-governing nation. After many years of negotiations through the BC Treaty Commission process, Tawasin received royal assent in 2008. Everything that they need to be a fully functioning society, they now have the ability to control those elements. So they control their membership, government structure, language, laws and justice, healthcare, education, lands and resources, and wealth distribution. Now, I want you to remember this chart because we are going to refer back to it when we start discussing how the Indian Act affected self-governing nations. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Métis history because the Métis also have a very rich history in Canada. So the definition of Métis is that you self-identify as Métis and not Indian or Indigenous. They have historical and contemporary ties to the Métis community and are accepted by the Métis community today. By the mid-1800s, large numbers of Métis people settled in the Red River Valley. In 1870, the Hudson Bay Company lands, known as Rupert's Land, was purchased and transferred to the new government of Canada. The Métis leader, Louis Riel, made it clear that the government would require their consent, and a treaty for a land base was negotiated. The Métis are a distinct cultural group of Aboriginal peoples that evolved to include elements of European settler life and Indigenous subsistence harvesting life. The government recognized that Métis people were distinct peoples with Indigenous title. So the Métis people and the government of Canada negotiated a treaty called the Manitoba Act of 1870. However, after this treaty was negotiated, the land transfer that should have occurred didn't. As a result, Métis people suffered many years of economic marginalization. Today, Métis people are fighting through provincial and national organizations, through the courts, for their Indigenous inherent rights. The Métis people hope that as a result of recent decisions by the Supreme Court of Canada, the Government of Canada will negotiate a modern treaty relationship with the Métis Nation. Assimilation is the practice of changing an individual from one culture identity to another, which can either be voluntary or involuntary. Indigenous way of life was incompatible with increased settlement and resource development needed for a growing modern country. Assimilation can involve changing a person's identity, language, customs, and traditions against that person's will. Towns and farms were needed on lands that had been promised as treaty rights to Indigenous peoples for hunting, trapping, and fishing. So by the 19th century, many people believed that assimilation of Indigenous people was necessary and inevitable. Many people believed them to be inferior. The government felt that providing programs and services promised in treaties was unnecessarily expensive. Rather than reneging outright on the deals, government officials believed a way around them would be by assimilation and would no longer require special considerations or respect. Chief Kinniseu, who was a Cree leader from the Lesser Slave Lake, was quoted as saying in 1899, "Indians don't want to be assimilated. They didn't want to change who they were, customs, language, traditions, or spiritual beliefs. They didn't want the government to take control over their lives. The Indian loves his way of living and his free life." In 1876, the Indian Act was created. The founding fathers of Canada planned to forcibly assimilate Indigenous peoples and their way of life. The government of Canada could control Indigenous people by passing laws. By 1876, the Indian Act was in place, which applied a different set of laws to Indians than those that governed other Canadians. The objective of the Indian Act was to control and change the Indian way of life. Sir John A. Macdonald, who was the Prime Minister of Canada, was quoted as saying in 1885, "We have been pampering and coaxing the Indians. We must vindicate the position of the white man. We must teach the Indians what law is." He was also quoted as saying that same year, "The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people on all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change." And again, our Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs in Duncan Campbell Scott was quoted as saying in 1920, "Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed, and there is no Indian question, and there is no Indian department." You might actually find it surprising to know that the Canadian government actually has a document that estimates by what year they will no longer have a need for the treaties, because Indigenous people will have been fully absorbed, assimilated into Canadian life. So the Indian Act is a complete opposite. It is a total breakdown of the Royal Proclamation. So the Royal Proclamation had originally stated that Indigenous peoples are nations, where the Indian Act states that Indians are wards of the state. So where the Royal Proclamation acknowledges that Indigenous people were here first and as nations could govern themselves, the Indian Act states that Indigenous people need to be dependent, taken care of. The Royal Proclamation stated that treaty promises must be signed and honored, where the Indian Act totally ignored the treaties. Royal Proclamation stated that Indians could remain Indians as long as the sun shines and the rivers flow. The Indian Act stated that Indians must change as soon as they are fit to change. It was as if a hostile takeover from a foreign government had occurred, one that didn't speak their language, did not believe that their way of life was sustainable, and believed that they were inferior. As a result of assimilation efforts of Canada, the spirit and intent of the treaty deals had vanished. This change of attitude by the Government of Canada would last well into the 20th century. In place of treaty deals was a set of laws that controlled and tried to change Indigenous peoples' culture, language, identity, their entire way of life. So how did the Indian Act affect self-government? So we go back to that graph that shows the 8 areas that nations need to be in control of in order to be classified as self-governing. So the Indian Act affected every area of Indigenous self-reliance. The Indian Act specified who could belong and who could be considered an Indian. So Indigenous nations no longer had the power to decide who their membership was. The Indian Act imposed a municipal style government structure where a minister had the final say. So no longer could Indigenous groups follow traditional traditional elections. And so if it was traditional that the chief, the role of chief was passed down from one generation to another within a family, that no longer applied because they now had to impose a municipal style government with elections. It prohibited Indigenous children at residential schools from speaking their own languages. In fact, children that were forced to attend residential school were actually punished, both physically and emotionally, for speaking their language. They were shamed. They were shamed if they tried to speak their language or perform their culture in any way. So they then internalized and started to believe that not only they were, but that their families were less than and heathen, evil. It prevented Indians from hiring lawyers and from challenging government decisions or laws through the courts. Also, they couldn't vote in provincial or federal elections. And so they didn't have access to laws and justices. They were forced this piece of legislation, but they had no ability to grieve it, to fight against it, because if they tried to hire a lawyer, they were punished. It stated that healthcare services were to be controlled by the Department of Indian Affairs. So their healthcare, they no longer were able to practice their traditional medicines. In fact, again, they were punished, sometimes even jailed for practicing their traditional medicines. They no longer were being taught by their families or communities. Children were snapped up and forced into residential school, usually very, very far away from their homes. In residential schools, children would often not see their families for many, many months and years at a time. And so by the time they were able to go back home, they had lost connection with their language and culture. The Indian Act denied Indians access to their traditional territories without permission. Indian agents were appointed to every area, and Indigenous people couldn't even leave the reserve without a permission or a permission pass from the Indian agent. And it had to state when they were allowed to be off the reserve and when they had to be back on the reserve. And if they were out, even for work, without that pass or extending that pass, they could be arrested and put in jail. And so their mobility was extremely limited. And finally, they had no ability to generate revenue from things like taxes or natural resources. So they no longer had any ability to create any of their own revenue. So every area of self-governing was crippled by the Indian Act. And so if you ever wonder why Indigenous people have reached the level of dysfunction that they have, you just need to look at the effects of the Indian Act on Indigenous people as a whole. The Indian Act was designed to control and change Indians. Despite this, many Indians persisted in maintaining their culture and identities. Something more aggressive was needed, and this was residential school. Attendance was mandatory. Parents were punished by the Department of Indian Affairs if they didn't send their children to residential school. Speaking Indigenous languages was forbidden and was replaced by Christian values. The Canadian government, in partnership with several churches, forcibly took Indigenous children away from their families and placed them in boarding schools. If you wish to educate the children, you must separate them from their parents. And this was a quote from Hector Louis Langevin, who was the Secretary of State for the provinces in 1883. He continues to say, if you leave them in the family, they may know how to read and write, but they will remain savages. Whereas by separating them in the way proposed, they acquire the habits and tastes of civilized peoples. Children were punished for speaking their languages and were told that their family's way of life was wrong, not shown love or raised by loving parents. As a result, children didn't learn to become loving parents themselves. And so the effects of residential school, long-term effects of residential school that we still are dealing with today. Some children didn't see their families for 10 years or more. Unfortunately, some didn't even make it home at all. The mortality rates at some schools were sometimes as high as 50%. Children lived in substandard conditions. Attendance was mandatory from age 5 to 16. Most parents had no idea the conditions faced by their children, and those that did had to send them anyway because it was the law. Malnutrition, fires, and epidemics such as TB or smallpox were common. Rather than an academic education, children were trained in subjects like industrial and domestic skills. Many children were physically, sexually, and emotionally abused. Children left these schools unable to cope with their parents or at large in Canadian society. At the height of the program in 1931, there were over 80 schools in operation. By 1979, only 12 residential schools were still open. The last school in Punachie, Saskatchewan, only closed in 1996, so not all that long ago. The last residential school closed in 1996. Many of the 80,000 school survivors still face challenges today. The residential school system damaged many survivors' children and grandchildren, still being felt today. Family structures and senses of belonging. Indigenous languages and cultures are all but lost across Canada. The Canadian government formally apologized to Indigenous peoples on June 11, 2008. And that apology on June 11, 2008, addressed by Prime Minister Stephen Harper stated, and this is a quote, "The Government of Canada built an educational system in which very young children were often forcibly removed from their homes, often taken far from their communities. Many were inadequately fed, clothed, and housed. All were deprived of the care and nurturing of their parents, grandparents, and communities. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis languages and cultural practices were prohibited in these schools. Tragically, some of these children died while attending residential schools, and others were never returned home. We now recognize that it was wrong to separate the children from rich and vibrant cultures and traditions, that it created a void in many lives and communities, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that in separating children from their families, we undermined the ability of many to adequately parent their own children and sowed the seeds for generations to follow. And we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that far too often these institutions gave rise to abuse and neglect and were inadequately controlled. And we apologize for failing to protect you. Not only did you suffer these abuses as children, but as you became parents, you were powerless to protect your own children from suffering the same experience. And for this, we are sorry. By the 1960s, the civil rights movement sprung up everywhere, advocating for equal rights for all people. Indigenous people were finally granted the right to vote in federal elections in 1960 and provincial elections in all the provinces over the next 10 years. In 1968, Pierre Trudeau championed the idea that Canada should be a just society, which all people were treated equally under the law with equal access to opportunities. Just society was a reoccurring theme for both of Trudeau's terms in office. Trudeau knew that Indigenous peoples were not treated as equals to other Canadians. He was quoted saying, "The attainment of a just society is the cherished hope of civilized men." The Indian Act had set out restrictive laws for governing the Indigenous people from other citizens. Deplorable living conditions for Indigenous peoples was also very common. 1969, Pierre Elliott Trudeau tried to address the inequalities faced by Indigenous peoples. His solution was to formally end the treaty agreements with Indigenous peoples, seeing them as a bygone era and the terms as very limited. Canada now saw the treaty agreements as the problem. He also suggested repealing the Indian Act and that Canada dissolve the Department of Indian Affairs within 5 years. Indigenous leaders responded to Trudeau's proposal quickly and with unity, an absolute and definite no. Trudeau withdrew his proposal, but the period had resulted in a new era of Indigenous political awakening. Trudeau proposed converting the reserves to private property and changed the Constitution to allow provinces to pass laws for program and service deliveries to Indians. As Canada did not believe in Aboriginal claims to land where treaties did not exist, Trudeau believed that no new treaties would be needed. Trudeau's solution didn't mention residential schools, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, or explain how dissolving the treaty relationship would result in justice. His solution also ignored the fact that Canada's treaty agreements would last as long as the sun shone and the rivers flowed. It was as if Canada didn't know its own history. Aboriginal leaders such as Chief Harold Cardinal from Alberta wrote a rebuttal and a book called The Unjust Society that highlighted the effects of Canada's assimilation policies and broken treaty promises. He maintained that Canada could not ignore its history nor the promises that had been made as part of the treaty deals. He argued that what Trudeau was proposing was just a modern version of assimilation. Aboriginal peoples formed national organizations and initiated lawsuits. For the first time in 100 years, Aboriginal and treaty rights were seriously being discussed in Canada's political corridors, which would eventually lead to protection of Aboriginal and treaty rights in the Constitution of 1982. So then what is a constitution and what is the importance of it? A constitution is a written document that sets out the basic rules of a country, outlining fundamental principles that all citizens and their elected governments agree to live by. Once written and agreed to, a constitution is meant to be very difficult to change. The Constitution is considered the supreme law of the land. Canada was one of the last countries to draft their own constitution, one that outlined basic human rights for all Canadians officially. Canada's constitution was formally the British North American Act of 1867. Britain still had final say over all laws passed in Canada. In 1922, the British Empire controlled 1/5 of the world's population, including Canada. By 1975, all former British Commonwealth countries had passed modern constitutions that outline protections against human and individual rights violations. Throughout his 2 terms, Pierre Elliott Trudeau pursued a goal of modernizing Canada's constitution. Constitutional discussions included the place of collective Indigenous and treaty rights held by Indigenous nations. In April 1982, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Queen Elizabeth II signed Canada's new constitution as the supreme law of the land, which carried forward important concepts outlined in the British North American Act of 1867 and included Section 12, the protection of Indigenous and treaty rights. Leaders of the federal and provincial governments had tried several times to reach agreement on what Canada's constitution should look like since the 1900s. Throughout the 1970s, Pierre Trudeau had initiated national discussions about what individual and collective rights should be reflected in Canada's new modern constitution. The importance of the French language and the multicultural nature of Canada was hotly debated. What would continue to have 3 branches, the executive, legislative assembly, and the judiciary courts. The federal government would still have the authority to pass laws over key national interests such as monetary policies, the military, treaties and Indians, and lands reserved for Indians. The provincial government would continue to have authority to pass laws over key regional interests such as local governments, healthcare, and ownership and control over natural resources. Canadians were now guaranteed fundamental freedoms such as the freedom of religion, thought, and expression. Democratic rights such as the right to vote or run for government, mobility rights such as the right to enter or leave the country or to move or work anywhere in Canada. Clear legal rights such as the right to life, liberty, security of the person, and legal counsel. Including citizens also had the right to be innocent until proven guilty and were protected against arbitrary detention, cruel and unusual punishment, and self-incrimination. Equality rights such as discrimination based on nationality, ethnicity, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability was now prohibited. And official languages, French and English, were now deemed the official languages of Canada. Citizens now had the right to be educated and to access federal government services in either language. Canada was officially deemed a multicultural society. Equalization, the principle that revenues were to be shared amongst provinces and territories to ensure comparable levels of services for all Canadians. And 12, the protection of Indigenous and treaty rights. In the new Constitution, there was also Section 35, which stated that the existing Indigenous and treaty rights of the Indigenous peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. What this meant was that the government, the federal government, finally recognized the treaties that were negotiated between the federal government and the nations, and that they were affirmed. They were saying that we recognize and we acknowledge that we need to abide by them. We need to honor these treaty conditions. In this act, Indigenous peoples of Canada include the Indian, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada. However, not a lot of details included, such as what existing meant, nor Indigenous and treaty rights. Did say recognized and affirmed, which meant that they were protected from that point forward. Section 35 limits the provincial and federal government's power to pass laws or do things that negatively impact Indigenous and treaty rights. The government has an obligation to legally justify any infringement of these rights. So ultimately, what this means is that after 1982, the governments now had to be extra careful in consultation when there was an encroachment, some type of infringement on Indigenous inherent rights, including land usage. So with all of this being said, it means that we have a lot of groundwork that has been laid. And so Canada now sits at a crossroad. Canada's treaty relationship is at a crossroad, and Canada has choices that they need to make. One path could implement the spirit and intent of the treaties, which could lead to a true reconciliation, negotiation through mutually beneficial agreements, and Indigenous people could actually reach their full potential. Or the other road chosen could be that we could continue to take a narrow interpretation, which will likely lead to further legal challenges, continuing protests, and substandard conditions measured by all social indications. That is our brief overview of understanding Aboriginal identity. There are courses out there that go much further in depth than what we did, but those last for weeks and months at a time. There is just so much more that we could, more details that we could go into, but our time together is brief. And so I would encourage you to continue reading. The U of A, University of Alberta, offers a course called Indigenous Canada, and I believe it is a 6-week course, 1 2-hour online session every week. I took it a couple of years ago, and it was fascinating. It was so eye-opening. And so, and I also believe that the course, to enroll in the course is free. And so I would encourage you to look into that as well. There are lots of books and resources out there as well. You can check out our additional resources and videos on our website at bearpawlegal.ca and follow us on social media as well. And so thank you for joining in today's session, and have a wonderful evening.